There is a particular kind of rain that falls on a city in October. Steady and cold, the kind that empties sidewalks and turns the world outside a diner window into a blurred smear of headlights and neon. Everything softened by the water running down the glass. It was in the warm, amber-lit interior of a diner exactly like that one. On a Tuesday evening when the rain had been falling without pause for the better part of 3 hours, that a 7-year-old boy named Theo Calloway pressed his small hand against his father's forearm and said something that would, in the gentle way of small, unremarkable moments, change the trajectory of the entire evening for 3 people who had no particular reason to know each other existed. "Dad," he said quietly, in the low voice children use when they have noticed something they consider important. "Can she eat with us?" His father, Marcus Calloway, was 35 years old. He was raising Theo alone, a widowed single parent navigating the logistical complexity of that life with the patient, slightly exhausted competence of someone who had long since stopped waiting for anything to get simpler and had learned instead to work steadily with the shape of things as they actually were. He was a high school history teacher at a school 20 minutes from their apartment, a job that paid modestly and rewarded him in ways that had nothing to do with money. He had been Theo's only present parent since Theo was 3, when Marcus's wife Diane had died following complications from a surgery that should have been routine and had not been. Marcus had not dated in the 4 years since Diane's death. Not because he had made any formal decision about it, but because the combination of grief and single parenthood and teaching and everything else that filled his days had left very little space for anything additional. He had learned gradually to be honest with himself about what was currently possible and what was not. Tonight was a Tuesday, which meant it was his and Theo's weekly diner night, a ritual established years earlier when Marcus had recognized that cooking dinner after a full day of teaching and Theo's after-school care sometimes exceeded his available energy, and that a diner with booths, laminated menus, and bottomless coffee was a perfectly reasonable solution to that problem. He had ordered Theo's usual scrambled eggs and bacon, the specific combination Theo had declared his favorite at age 5 and had shown no signs of reconsidering since, and was cutting it into manageable pieces when Theo's hand pressed against his forearm. "Can she eat with us?" Theo repeated. Marcus looked up. A few feet away, at the small table directly beside theirs, a woman sat alone. She was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a gray business jacket and skirt, the kind of clothes that suggested she had come from an office rather than anywhere she had chosen to be. Her hair was pulled back, loose at the edges in the way hair gets at the end of a long day, and she sat with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking out at the rain with an expression that was not exactly sad, but had the quality of someone who has been working hard at something internal for some time and is quietly, visibly exhausted by the effort. There was no food in front of her, just the coffee. She had not opened the menu. Marcus took all of this in with the quick, practiced attentiveness of a parent and a teacher, someone whose professional and personal life had trained him over many years to read the small, visible signals of how a person is actually doing beneath the composed surface they present to the world. "Buddy," he said quietly, "we don't know her. She looks lonely," Theo said, with the directness children bring to observations adults would generally speak around rather than name. "And she doesn't have any food, and it's raining outside, and we have extra chairs." Marcus looked at the extra chair at their table. There was, in fact, one, because they had been seated at a 4-person booth as they often were when the diner wasn't full, and the other 2 chairs simply sat empty. He looked at the woman again. She had not appeared to hear any of this. Her attention was still turned toward the window. "I don't want to make her uncomfortable," Marcus said. "What if she's more uncomfortable being alone?" Theo asked. Marcus sat with this for a moment, the way parents do when their children have just said something that cannot be easily answered because it is, in its simple, unfiltered way, correct. He thought about what it was like to sit alone in a public place when you were not all right. He had done it himself, several times, in the year after Diane died, sitting in coffee shops and diners because going home to the apartment felt unbearable, but also unable to be around anyone he actually knew, who would look at him with the careful, worried eyes of people who knew what he had lost. The particular ache of being surrounded by people and still profoundly alone. He stood up. He approached the woman's table at a respectful distance, and when she turned from the window to look at him, he spoke simply and without preamble. "My son noticed you sitting alone," he said. He'd like to know if you'd like to join us for dinner. There's no obligation and no pressure either way. If you'd prefer to be left alone, we understand completely. But the offer is genuine." The woman looked at him for a moment, then passed him at Theo, who was watching from the booth with solemn, hopeful eyes, having apparently decided the situation warranted his most earnest expression. Something shifted in her face, a careful loosening of whatever she had been holding in place behind the composed, exhausted surface. "That's very kind," she said quietly. "Are you sure?" "Entirely," Marcus said. "We've got 2 empty chairs and more scrambled eggs than he's going to finish." She looked at the rain on the window for a moment, then back at Theo, then at Marcus. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." Her name was Nora Whitfield. She was 32 years old, a contract attorney who had spent the past 14 months on a demanding case that had consumed most of her waking hours and left her, by her own quiet admission, somewhat uncertain of what her life looked like underneath the work. She had come to the diner that evening not because she had planned to, but because she had walked out of her office at 8 after a conference call that resolved nothing, stood on the wet sidewalk trying to remember what she was supposed to do next, and then simply walked toward the nearest lit window, because the rain was falling and she needed to sit somewhere that wasn't her apartment, where the silence had a quality lately she had not been able to adequately address. She did not tell Marcus any of this right away. They began as strangers do, with smaller things. Theo explaining with great authority the specific reasons scrambled eggs were superior to all other preparations of eggs, and Nora listening with the kind of genuine attention that delights children because it is so clearly not performed. "What do you think about omelets?" Theo asked, narrowing his eyes slightly, clearly probing for a point of disagreement. "I think they have their place," Nora said carefully. "But I think you're not wrong that scrambled, done properly, is hard to argue against." Theo considered this. "I'll accept that answer," he said. Marcus, across the table, found himself smiling the way he did when Theo said something that surprised him by being simultaneously funny and oddly dignified. The food arrived. Nora had ordered soup, the practical choice of someone who hadn't eaten properly in several hours and knew it, and the conversation expanded gradually, the way conversation does when 3 people have decided, without formally deciding, that they are comfortable enough with each other to stop managing the interaction carefully. Marcus told Nora what Theo had actually said, because it seemed only fair for her to know what had prompted the invitation. "He said you looked lonely," Marcus said, with a small, apologetic smile. "He's 7. He observes things without the filter that generally tells adults not to say them aloud." Nora laughed, a genuine one, the kind that briefly reorganizes a face that has been serious for too long. "He wasn't wrong," she said. "I was." She looked at Theo. "Thank you for noticing. That's what you do when someone looks lonely," Theo said, with the complete straightforwardness of someone for whom this was simply an obvious fact about how people were supposed to treat each other. "You invite them. Your dad taught you that?" Nora asked. Theo thought about this. "He does it too," he said. "So I think maybe we both just know it." Marcus, hearing this, felt something quiet and unexpected move through him. The feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had only been watching him for 20 minutes, but had watched carefully. "Diane," he said after a moment, because something about the evening had created exactly the kind of space where this felt appropriate to say, "My wife. She used to tell me that the difference between a life that feels full and a life that feels empty is almost entirely about how willing you are to let people in when the opportunity arrives." I think Theo absorbed that. "She sounds like someone worth learning from," Nora said. "She was," Marcus said simply. "She still is, in the ways that matter." They stayed for almost 2 hours, the rain continuing against the window, the diner filling and emptying around them in its ordinary Tuesday rhythm, the 3 of them finding, in the extended way of an evening that was no longer anyone's plan, that the conversation carried none of the effort most conversations with strangers do. Theo fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder around 9, with the sudden, complete unconsciousness of children who have decided the evening is finished, one hand still resting on the table near his empty plate. "He trusts you completely," Nora said, watching the sleeping boy with a quiet expression. "I'm the only consistent thing in his life," Marcus said. "I take that seriously." "I can tell," she said. "It shows in him. The confidence he has, the way he just walks up and invites a stranger to dinner because it seems like the obvious thing to do." She paused. Not many children are that open. It comes from somewhere. His mother, Marcus said. And maybe a little from me. I try. Nora and Marcus exchanged numbers before they left. Not dramatically, not with any particular declaration about what it might mean, but with the mutual, unspoken acknowledgement that the evening had been something worth not losing entirely when it ended. I'm not sure what I'm looking for right now, Nora said honestly, standing at the diner door while Marcus adjusted the sleeping Theo against his shoulder. I'm in a strange stretch of my life. I understand that, Marcus said. I'm in a different kind of strange stretch myself. I'm not suggesting anything beyond what it is, which is that tonight was genuinely good, and I'd like to have coffee with you sometime, because you were easy to talk to, and that's rarer than people expect. Nora looked at him for a moment, then at Theo, still asleep against his father's shoulder, with no awareness that he had changed the shape of an entire evening simply by asking one honest question. Okay, she said. Coffee. They had coffee the following week, and the week after that, and what grew between them in the months that followed was built, as the best things tend to be, on the unhurried foundation of two people who had been through enough to know what actually mattered, and were willing, finally, to be honest about it. Theo, for his part, took full credit for the entire situation whenever the subject came up, which was often, and which Marcus and Nora allowed, because it was, in the most important sense, entirely accurate. I just knew she needed to eat dinner with someone, he would say, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone describing an action that required very little analysis, because the right thing to do had simply been obvious. And it had been. Perhaps that is the quiet truth tucked inside a rainy Tuesday evening like this one, that the instinct toward kindness does not require elaborate justification or careful planning. Sometimes it is simply a child pressing his hand against his father's arm and asking a straightforward question, because he has noticed someone sitting alone and understands, without needing to be taught, that the obvious response to loneliness is an invitation. The door to connection is very often unlocked. It simply needs someone willing to open it. And perhaps that is what we carry forward, not the memory of grand gestures, but the simple, steady practice of noticing the person beside us who hasn't opened the menu yet, who is looking at the rain like it's the only company they have, and choosing, as simply and directly as a 7-year-old boy, to offer them the empty chair.